It will never be forgiven. By they, I mean the Western governments who have armed and facilitated Israel's genocide for 465 days as I speak, knowing full well the horrors being inflicted every single day. By they, I mean the Western media outlets who have legitimized Israel's war crimes, who have failed to frame their coverage around the explicitly and repeatedly stated genocidal intent of Israeli leaders and officials who have airbrushed atrocities, failed to hold their governments to account for their criminal complicity, and failed to even show a modicum of solidarity for the Palestinian journalists who have suffered the biggest slaughter of media workers in the history of human civilization as they risk their lives every single day to bring the world the depraved, hideous truth of what Israel is doing to the Palestinian people. Which brings me to this devastating speech. It is a speech by the Palestinian journalist Abu Bakr Ahmed, who is from Deir al-Balah in Gaza. He's only 22 years old, and he has already done more important work than countless Western journalists combined will ever do in their whole careers. And he has done so while risking his life every single day, every single hour, every single minute. It's a press conference, and it's addressed to the Western media. Please listen and listen carefully.
These are not my words, but the words of every single one here, standing here after 459 days of the most well-documented and first live-streamed genocide in history. For these days, we've been reporting tirelessly, extensively and thoroughly on this genocide. It's indeed a genocide against us, which we've been documenting in makeshift tented camps and workplaces. They are really the places we've taken shelter since day one. You've seen us shedding tears over our loved ones, colleagues, friends, and family members. You've seen us killed in every possible way. We've been immolated, incinerated, dismembered, and disemboweled. And recently, we've been freezing to death. What more ways should you be seeing us killed in so that you can move and act and stop the hell inflicted upon us? There are no words to describe what we've been going through, because you've seen our bodies, how they've become fragile, skinny, and fatigued. But we never stopped. We never stopped to tell you the truth, to narrate our stories, and to tell you that we are being genocided, to move your dead consciences, to help a population that has seen every sort of torture and tasted every type of death. Today, we're all standing here after Israel's impunity against us. And we don't know how many journalists should be killed so you can really act and stop Israel's impunity against us. Our message is very clear. We are journalists, and we are Palestinian journalists. We have been let down by the international community, particularly the international media organization. We haven't seen any sort of support, a single word of support. Even the press vests we're wearing right now mark us as a target. They do not protect us at all. But yes, because we are Palestinians, maybe if we were Ukrainians or of any other citizenship with blonde hair and blue eyes, the word would rage and rant for us. But because we are Palestinians, we have only one right, which is to die and be maimed. Finally, we are just documenting a genocide against us. It's enough after almost a year and a half. We want you to stand foot by foot with us, because we are like any other journalists, reporters, and media workers all across the globe, no matter the origin, the color, or the race. Journalism is not a crime. We are not a taunt.
This is a speech which should trigger an overwhelming sense of shame amongst Western journalists, but it won't, because the vast majority of them won't even listen to it. For many of them, courage is defined by saying and writing terrible things about marginalised minorities in the rags they work for, and then getting criticised about it by teenagers on social media, where they then claim to be the victims who are suffering the trauma, the horror of being scrutinised by members of the public for making life that little bit harder for people whose lives are already too hard. These Western journalists like to think of themselves as noble truth tellers speaking out without fear or favour, and there are some of those that are courageous journalists here in the West. That's without question. There are just too few, not least in positions of prominence and influence. Well, Israel's genocide has certainly exposed the vast majority of the Western media for who they are. They knew from the beginning that Israeli leaders and officials repeatedly declared that civilians in Gaza were human animals, that they would illegally cut off all the essentials of life to them, like like food and water and energy, that they believed all civilians in Gaza had collective guilt, that there was no such thing as civilians who were not aware, not involved, as Israel's president put it. As they bragged they would flatten Gaza, that as one Israeli minister put it after the first few weeks, the north of the Gaza Strip, simply a pleasure for the eyes, as they boasted about the destruction there, the total destruction. They know Israeli ministers boasted they were doing another Nakba, that is, a repeat of the murderous ethnic cleansing of Palestinians by Israel in 1948. They may not have heard every single statement. They may not have heard that Israel's defense minister Yoav Gallant declared at the start variously that he had lifted every restriction and every restraint on Israeli soldiers, but my goodness, did they hear enough. They saw with their own eyes the ever more apocalyptic footage from Gaza as its buildings were so comprehensively destroyed that it now has a completely different colour and texture when looked at from space. They may not have used a tape measure to work out just how small Gaza is, which is no bigger than East London, but they knew it is a tiny territory, and they may not have known that several times the explosive power of Hiroshima was detonated there by the Israeli military, but they knew it was a vast amount. They knew that thousands upon thousands of civilians were being slaughtered, that included entire bloodlines wiped from the face of the earth over and over again, that so many of the slaughtered were children and babies, but they showed more outrage over the false claims of Israeli babies being beheaded on 7th of October than they did about literally hundreds of Palestinian newborns being incinerated by explosives, crushed to death under destroyed buildings, and literally suffocated to death in besieged and attacked hospitals as they were ripped away from their ventilators. They may not have known the name of practically any slaughtered Palestinian child, but even they must have heard about Hind Rajab, a 5-year-old little girl with a beautiful smile whose family, her aunt, uncle and 4 other cousins tried to flee their home for safety. Most of them killed, leaving just her and 15-year-old cousin Leanne alive. Leanne desperately ringing the Palestine Red Crescent pleading for help before you hear her slaughtered on that call by a tank. An ambulance sent to save little Hind, now on the phone, terrified, in a car full of the bloodied corpses of her family as she begged for help, as she pleaded. She was terrified of the dark. The paramedics sent to save her, who coordinated their journey with the Israeli Defense Forces, who were then blown up by the Israeli army, barely anything remaining of their corpses, and then days later, the decomposing bodies of Hind and her family were discovered. They may not have known that every single aid agency, as well as 2 government departments, concluded over and over and over again many months ago that Israel was deliberately starving the Palestinian people, as was promised by Israeli leaders from the beginning, but they certainly knew enough. They may have tried to avoid hearing the endless stories of Israeli soldiers torturing and raping Palestinians, including to death, but even some of them must have heard about a riot in support of the right to rape Palestinian detainees on the streets of Tel Aviv, attended by Israeli ministers this summer. Did they really think that there was some legitimate moral or military end which justified unleashing this level of death, destruction, carnage, suffering, killing so many more times the number of Israelis killed on the 7th of October, day after day after day after day, for 465 days? They knew enough. And yet many of them carried on justifying this barbarism. They knew enough, and yet many of them refused to speak out apart from empty hand-wringing and platitudes. Let's be generous. Maybe some of them were scared. I know some of them are scared. Maybe they feared being smeared as racists or terrorist supporters because they happened to object to the mass slaughter of innocent people. Maybe they feared their careers would be menaced, that they'd be deplatformed. None of them irrational fears, but I'll tell you this, none of these fears are worth even 1,000th or 1,000,000th of the fears of Palestinian journalists spending every day fearing that this may not only be their last day, but the last day of every single person they love. Cowardice, not least in an age of genocide, is complicity. If you have a platform, if you have influence, and if you have power. They knew enough, and they helped drown the Palestinian in blood. That blood, of course, spilled by Western weapons. Because if the Western media actually did its job and made clear the gravity of this crime, then it would have been stopped a long time ago. Well, I'll tell you this. It wasn't just the politicians. It wasn't just the politicians and the executioners of the Rwandan genocide who ended up in the dock. It was the journalists who were complicit in that genocide as well. We must not let them get away with this. No crime in history was so confessed to, so publicly, so proudly, so repeatedly. No crime in history was so documented as it actually happened. There is no excuses. There is nowhere to hide, and everyone who has their fingerprints over the crime scene must be held to account. And yet, with notable exceptions, as the Palestinian people who actually did the work, knowing that at any moment they could be exterminated alongside their entire families, these same Western journalists couldn't even bring themselves to type or mutter a word of solidarity. solidarity with their colleagues. They don't think Palestinians are humans. That's not hyperbole, it's a statement of the obvious, because nobody, not a single person who really thinks Palestinians are of equal worth would ever tolerate what has been inflicted upon them in what is a genocide. Hell, if you thought Palestinians were worth a fraction of the worth of the people you considered your own, you wouldn't tolerate this. What did they think was happening when so many genocide and Holocaust scholars came out and said, this is a genocide? Did they not think to themselves, even if they hadn't brought themselves to accept this was a genocide, if it was a live debate where so many Holocaust and genocide scholars had concluded this was a genocide, then this must be a pretty gruesome crime. Did they not think that if the International Criminal Court had gone through all that rigmarole, all the pressure exerted upon them, and gone through so many legal experts and concluded that the leaders of Israel were committing grave, extreme war crimes and crimes against humanity, then there must be a bloody good case? Did they not think that? Well, history will not grant them excuses. We owe it to journalists like Abu Bakr Abed to speak out, because we have a privilege. We are not about to be bombed and shot dead because we're using our platform to speak out. We owe it to them. We owe it to them to hold to account the media outlets and politicians who enabled the genocide in plain sight. And that accountability might take years, it might take decades, but we must never, ever, ever, ever give up on holding all of the guilty to account, because otherwise crime after crime after crime will be committed over and over again, normalised, because we failed to hold to account all of the guilty parties. Please like and subscribe, leave your thoughts in your comments.